Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons. What did God say about King Saul? He said, I have rejected him from being king over my people. But please, was Saul not still king? He was king. But God said, I have rejected him. In the natural, he was still king. In the spiritual, he was already rejected. As a matter of fact, if you look at the scriptures and read it very well, it was essentially Saul only reigned 2 years under God. The other 38 years of his reign, he was reigning as a rejected king. But there's something that we need to understand about God, which we don't understand. God cannot have a vacuum. There can never be a vacuum with God. So what God does is, instead of create a vacuum which will result in anarchy, he will rather keep a bad king in place while he's training the one that is coming to take over. So, for example, when people say, oh, why are women in ministry, or why are women heading ministry? And I always say to them, shame on the men. God is not going to allow a vacuum. So he will put somebody, whether it's a woman, doesn't matter, he put somebody in that place until the man is ready to assume leadership. We speak about Deborah, for example. Deborah was a judge in Israel. But Deborah was not supposed to be the judge. Barak just was unable to do it. In fact, when Deborah said to him that God says go, he said, no. If you don't go with me, I won't go. And God told Barak, okay, since that's the Deborah told Barak, well, since that's the case, this is what God says. If I go with you, then a woman will take the glory and not you. And that's what happened. So in the reign of Deborah over Israel, you actually have Deborah and Barak, but Barak at the back, while Deborah was in the forefront. So God does not have a vacuum. When you have a leadership gap, somebody must stay in that gap until the true leader comes in. Now, let's go to verse 13 and 14. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, that is David, in the midst of his brothers. And note this, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. Now, look at verse 14. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. So he was a king who had a disturbing spirit upon him. And Saul spent his 38 years pursuing David all over the place. Not being able to rule the nation, not being able to do anything. In fact, you will recall that at one time, after this had happened, Goliath came and threatened Israel. Is that not so? A king is supposed to protect the nation. King Saul was there. He couldn't do anything because Goliath was a spiritual agent of Satan. He was a human being, all right, but the spirit that was pushing him, I think I mentioned it last week, that one of the things that these principalities and powers do is to bring oppression against the people of God. So what Goliath of Gath was doing was to oppress the people of God. And so he came for 40 years, for 40 days rather, prancing up and down. And nobody could do anything. Because the king, who was King Saul at the time, the Spirit of God had left him. It took Jesse sending David to the battlefield and David going in obedience to his father to hear what Goliath was saying and for his spirit to be stirred that who is this uncircumcised? David understood what was happening. Even though he was 17 years old, he was a boy, because of the Spirit of God that was already in him. He said, how can this uncircumcised be challenging the armies, the host of the God of Israel? As far as he was concerned, this was an affront on God. It took that 17-year-old boy to deal with Goliath. It wasn't really a 17-year-old boy doing it. It was the Spirit of God in him that was doing it. How expert can you be in throwing a stone that the stone will get just the only opening in the head of that fellow? That was the Spirit of God at work.